Jsp Scopes and Java Servlet Scopes. Why we jump to this concept? Because in order to store data, you need this concept. Okay? And this scope, remember, here the scope we talk about here is different from the scopes we discussed a few slides before. Few slides, we talk about class scope, method scope. Here, the scope concept is different. We have another type of scopes we need to discuss. And those scope cases related to data storage. So we need to do that first. Okay, all right. First, Jsp scopes. So what are those scopes? There are 4 different scopes for Jsp. Application scope, session scope, request scope, and page scope. So what is the application scope? You can store your data here. You store your data in application scope. But when you store in application scope, every file inside this application can access that data. Every servlet JSP in this web application can access this data. So that's the global scope. Okay? So that is the first one. Second one is session scope. Session scope. We know a session can, a session can store data through multiple pages. Multiple pages. Okay? A session. So the session scope. So when you maintain a shopping cart in a session, so that shopping cart, after you do a lot of things, the information stored, data stored in that shopping cart still there. Yeah? So that's the session. So we want to keep our data for some time. Yeah? So that's the session. Yeah? Session smaller than the application. Yeah? Because session can expire, right? The session can expire. So after some time, the session expires, the data is gone. Okay? Yeah. The next smaller scope, you can see based on this order, the scope becomes smaller and smaller. Okay? Yeah. Along this direction, smaller and smaller. Then the request scope, smaller than the session scope. Your data only kept for the period of the current request. Remember, request response. After one cycle, it is done. Then you need to start another request, then response. Okay? So your data stored in this request, it only stays in this cycle. Okay? It only stays in that cycle. When you start a new cycle, that old data is gone. Okay? So you cannot retrieve the old data. Yeah. So that is the request scope. All right. Then the last one, the smallest, page scope is the smallest. Because in one request response cycle, you can have many pages, P1, P2, P3, right? Multiple pages. Page 1 has its own scope. Page 2 has its own scope. Page 3 has its own scope, right? But all of them share the same request scope, okay? So later, we will look at that difference. Yeah, more. Yeah. Here, I just give you this concept the first time, Jsp scopes. Similarly, for the servlets, we have the servlet scopes. But for servlet, only 3 scopes: application, session, and request, because there is no page concept. For servlet, there is no page concept. Only JSP has that page concept. Servlet, no page. Yeah. So that's why no page scope. Yeah. Now, after you understand this concept, now we can talk about access data in scopes. Yeah. All right. First, store data in any one of the scopes. You can do this way. Here, I just give you an example. I store in the request scope. Request dot set attribute, then 2 parameters. Here, let me explain the 2 parameters. The first one, parameter type should be object. But usually people use string. Why? Because that corresponds to name of the attribute. Name of the attribute, but sometimes also called a key of the attribute. If it is a key, then you can use any object, right? Yeah. Yeah. So that's why the original type is object, but most of the time, people use string to provide name of the attribute. Okay. Yeah, so that's the first parameter. The second parameter, value, that is an object. Okay. The object of that attribute. Yeah. So that is the way to store data. Second, retrieve data. Yeah. Later, you need to retrieve the data. So when you retrieve the data, you need to be very careful. Because here, when we retrieve the data, we retrieve data through the attribute name. Yeah, only one parameter, attribute name. So it returns the attribute value. Return attribute value. Okay? But when you return attribute value, what is the data type of your attribute value? Okay? Is it a string? Not necessary, right? Because when you store the value, it is some object, some special object, right? Yeah, not necessarily a string object, right? So when you retrieve your original data, you need to recover it to its original object. You need to recover to the original object. Otherwise, if you do not recover to the original object, what is the format of this one? When you call, it is object. It is the capital Java object type. But if you have the capital Java object type, you cannot call any business methods inside it because the original Java object does not have any business method. Okay? No specific the business method. Okay? So it cannot do any business. You don't like that, right? So it is useless. So that's why you have to recover to your original object type by casting, by appropriate casting. So you need to know the original object type. So you can put that type here, parenthesis, to do the casting to recover to the original object. Otherwise, you cannot do anything useful. Okay? All right. So that's the second step. Then the last step, in some situation, you may like to remove data in the scope. Yeah. Usually for the session data. Because session data, the data stored inside session stays there for a while. Stays there, for some time, for the duration of your session object. But sometimes after you complete some specific business task, you don't need that data. So you want to save some memory space. In that situation, you want to remove the data from the session. Okay? In that situation, you can do this. Session.remove attribute, the name of the attribute. So you remove it. Remove that particular attribute. Yeah. Other attributes are still there. So you just remove this attribute. All right. So that's the scope concept. After you understand the scope concept, now you can understand this line easily, right? Yeah. So we store our data in the request scope. Yeah. Later, we need to retrieve the data, but when we retrieve, we must be in the same request scope. Okay? Yeah. If you go to a different request scope, you cannot retrieve that data. Okay? You cannot retrieve that data. When you're in the same request scope, you can retrieve that data. Okay? Yeah. So that's the background about the scope. Yeah. All right. Next, then we can talk about data retrieval in our login page. Remember, we have login page.jsp. Okay, and remember the previous page, we use the forward way. We use the forward way to get to this page. Forward way to get to this page. Okay, all right. Retrieve data from the request scope. Yeah. Now we do this. Yeah. That is the code in that login page.jsp. Yeah. So in this one, so you can see in this one, yeah. Request get attribute first. Yeah. Remember, we store the data before. Okay, so we have the data. Okay, so that's the name. Now we request that, so it should give us the value fail value. Okay, all right. So after we retrieve it, we need to do casting. Okay, you need to do casting. Okay, yeah. So don't forget this parenthesis string, yeah, the object type. Yeah. All right. After that, you need to make sure your login object is not null. Okay. So in Java, every time when you have an object, when you have an object type variable, you need to do this not null checking. Otherwise, if you forget to do this not null checking, what would happen? Sometimes this object could be null. If in case it is null, then you will have a runtime error. It is a runtime error. Not compile error, it's a runtime error. It is very annoying. So if you have runtime error, you need to fix the problem. Because sometimes you have runtime error, sometimes you do not. Okay? When you do testing, yeah. So think about the situation. When you do testing, because the data you use for testing very limited. The data you use for testing very limited. So you couldn't find the data that will cause the runtime error. So you couldn't find the problem. But in application, when the user uses your application, they may get a runtime error. Then your users will not be very happy. Okay? Yeah. So that's why runtime error is a very big bad thing for your users. Yeah. So that's why here in your Java code, every time when you use a Java object, you need to do this check. Yeah. So make sure it is a valid object. Yeah. Now, after the checking step, you can check its value. Okay, double quotes fail equals double quotes fail or not. So you can do that comparison. Otherwise, you think about if you do not do the checking, now you get here, you do this checking, logging dot equal null object, you cannot call any of its method, right? If it's a null object, how can you call its method? You cannot. So you will get a runtime error. Yeah. So that problem we want to avoid. Yeah. So that's the reason this step is very simple, but don't forget to do it in Java programming. All right, so that's one thing. The second thing is, I want to point out this forward thing. This forward thing. So look at this. We store our attribute value in the request scope, right? Yeah. Then, when we get to this page, because this is in the servlet, this is in our servlet. Okay, yeah, we do this in our servlet. Here, it is in the JSP. Login page .jsp. Okay, these two things are two different resources, right? One servlet, one JSP. They are two different resources. But why you can access data? Why you can access data from your login.jsp, but the data is stored in the servlet? Why you can do that? Why the data is still there, right? This data is not lost. The data is still there. Why is that? The reason for this question, the reason, because we use the forward method. When we use the forward method, okay, they stay in the same, they means these two resources, JSP and the servlet, they stay in the same request scope. They stay in the same request scope. That's the the property determined by the forward. When you do forward way, you stay in the same request scope. Okay? But when you do request, a redirect, not request. When you do redirect, okay? You start a new request. Okay? That's the main difference. When you do the forward way, you stay in the old request. Okay? When you do redirect, you complete the old request, but you start a new request, HTTP request. Okay? That means the data in the old request is gone. You cannot access anymore. You start a completely new request object. That's the key difference. Okay? Here at the end of this slide, we get to the reason, the key difference of these two different ways to send our, send our flow. Here, I want to use flow, right? Yeah, suitable word, our flow, page flow or web flow, okay? Page flow or web flow to a new resource. When you do that, you have two choices, redirect choice and forward choice. But you need to know the differences. There are several differences. Okay? You know the differences. So you can decide which way is the best. And actually here, I haven't complete all the differences at this point. Yeah. So the next time, I will expand to cover all the differences of these two concepts. Yeah. Yeah. So there, you need to see a few more differences. Okay, forward and redirect. Yeah, this is because this is a big concept, very big concept. So I spent a lot of time to explain these two things. Yeah. All right, that's pretty much what I want to cover for this lecture. Okay, yeah. So then when I go back, I will split this video. Based on the content. So I will split this video into 2 or 3 smaller videos. Yeah. So then I will post. Yeah. The notes I already post. The PowerPoint slides I already post. Yeah. So you can do study. The remaining, first you work on the quiz number 2. I just posted last weekend, and also I post some comprehension questions. So you can use the comprehension question to help you answer the quiz questions. But after that, I will post our homework number 1 quickly. Yeah. We need to do our homework assignment number 1. Okay. Yeah. So then after that, I will post project number 1. Okay. Yeah. So all all these things we need to have them one by one. Okay. Homework 1 next, project 1 after it. Okay. All right. And but this So today we just start module 3. Yeah. But this weekend I need to post. Quiz for module 3. But when I post, remember, because I give you 1 week. Yeah. So this weekend I post, but you have 1 week to complete it. Yeah. All right. So that's pretty much what we have today.